We like to think that we are proud Indians, but how much do we really know of India's history? We grew up on the idea that India was the golden bird, the Sone ki chidiya. But I can bet that many of you sitting here would struggle to write 5 paragraphs to explain why India was the bleeding intellectual heart of the ancient world. For example, did you know that the year 664 of the Common Era, which our next guest at the India Today Conclave argues, is the moment when the Indosphere reached the peak of its global influence? This was the time when Indian religion, technology, astronomy, music, dance, literature, maths, and mythology blazed a trail across the world, forming a golden road that stretched from the Red Sea to the Pacific. Like ancient Greece, ancient India came up with profound answers to the questions about what the world is, how it operates, why we are here, and how we should live our lives. Today, over half the world's population lives in regions where Indian religions and culture are or once were dominant. William Dalrymple's new book, The Golden Road, reveals how in the millennium and a half from about 250 BC to 1200 AD, Indian ideas transformed the ancient world, crossing political borders to influence everything from the statues of ancient ascetics at the Roman seaports to Buddhism in China and the observatories of Baghdad to crucial mathematical concepts like the zero and even the numbers that we use today. We are delighted to be joined at the India Today Conclave by best-selling author, ace historian, William Dalrymple, who will argue and explain why India, that is Bharat, is one of the 3 great intellectual and philosophical superpowers of the ancient world. Mr. Dalrymple, welcome. Thank you so much. It is a delight to have you with us, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. To whoever's spoken to me all through the day, you'd know that I've said that this is the one session you really should watch out for. Will, I'm not a student of history, but I've read some history. And as I read your book, and I want you to start by explaining that, I wonder why this hasn't been done earlier. We've read Indian history in parts, Buddhism in parts, the southern kingdoms in parts, trading with Rome in parts, but bringing it together and explain why you think that it's important for every single person sitting here to know that not because of mythological reasons, but because of actual historical fact, you argue that India was the intellectual superpower of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, can we have a round of applause as I welcome and introduce William Dalrymple, sir. Over to you.
Thank you, Rahul. So it has been done before, but not for a bit. There's a very similar book written in 1954, which I'm sure everyone in this audience has read, The Wonder That Was India by A.L. Basham, which whole generations were brought up on. But it's an odd thing that there isn't a book which has pulled this together. And what inspired me to write it is, I think there is such an urge at this moment to situate India's rise in its historical context, because history shows very clearly that for most of history, India has been the richest region of the world. Occasionally, China pips it to the post. But up until the time of Vasco da Gama, up until the 15th century, the 2 areas which dominate the world economy, and that's not even to start on philosophical ideas and ideas of maths and so on, were India and China. The difference, I think, that has developed is that in the colonial period, the British and other European powers were very good at putting the case for Greece as the place which came up with basic mathematical and philosophical ideas that explained the big questions of humanity. Why are we here? What is this world that we occupy? Since then, the Chinese have been spectacularly good at placing themselves at the center of this idea, the Silk Road. Most of us, I think, have grown up imagining that the Silk Road is an idea which has always been there, which is a geopolitical reality, not a theory. In reality, the Silk Road was an invention of a German geographer in 1877, Baron von Richthofen. He came up with this idea which he called the Seidenstraßen. He was designing a railway from Berlin to Beijing. And it's only in the 1930s that this idea enters the English language, with a German Nazi-sympathizing explorer called Sven Hedin, who writes a book called The Silk Road. And then in the 80s, it becomes a popular idea. You come across, carpet shops calling themselves Silk Road carpets, or hotels in Tashkent. And there's 3 big exhibitions, one in the National Gallery of Arts in Washington, which launched this idea of the Silk Road. And the Chinese since then have been very good at building the whole Belt and Road initiative on top of that. And the impression is given that India was peripheral. I mean, let me show you a map. This is the basic map of the Silk Road that you see reproduced. It goes from the Mediterranean Sea in a straight line across the middle of Asia, across the top of Persia, Samarkand and Tashkent and the Stans, and across the whole width of China. But if you look at that map, you almost don't notice that India is entirely marginalized by this concept. That India is a place, on this map at least, which doesn't have cities, which doesn't have ports. Even the maritime route goes round it without stopping at any named port. And this has been the effect, whether deliberate or otherwise, that India has ceased to be seen as the center of world trade, as the center of ideas. But I'd like you to just memorize in your heads, guys, this map for a second, and compare it to this map. This is a map designed by the Oxford Archaeological Department last year. And what it shows is Roman coin hoards. Now, every place there's an orange dot, a Roman coin hoard has been found. Now, you'll notice that this map has absolutely no resemblance to the first map. As you'd expect, most of the Roman coins in the world have been found in Europe, in Italy, in Greece, in southern Britain, in France, and in Germany. There's another rim of orange around the Mediterranean and going down the Nile. But where the Silk Road is, virtually nothing. There's 1 or 2 dots in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But instead, look at where Roman gold is actually found. India and Sri Lanka, major centers of world trade. And that is there in the classical sources. If you look in Pliny, he says that India is the drain of all the precious metals in the world. His contemporary Strabo, another geographer based in Egypt, talks about fleets of 250 vessels leaving the Red Sea coast and sailing in just 2 months to India. So it's time that we recovered this lost centrality of India. India as the principal trading partner of the Roman Empire, because there is no evidence at all that Rome and China had the slightest conception of each other's existence. We do not know one single trade mission that left China for Rome, a single diplomatic mission that left Rome for China. But every year, fleets of hundreds of vessels were leaving the Egyptian coast, going down the Red Sea, and arriving in India. And your ancestors, the Indians of the classical period, were like the Saudis today. They barely had to get out of bed because the things that they were selling, cotton, pepper, ivory, wild beasts for the circuses, were the mega luxury goods of the time. They were the most expensive items. And gold, as you can see on the right-hand corner, bottom right-hand corner of that map, was pouring out of the Roman world into Indian pockets throughout the classical period. My theory is that the Silk Road didn't actually exist until the Mongols smashed a hole through the middle of Asia in the 13th century, connecting the Mediterranean to the South China Sea. And at that point, Marco Polo can go across the Silk Road in the 13th century. But in the classical period, which is the period I'm writing about, India is the center of world trade. And the reason it's the center is the monsoon winds. India has this great gift that the winds blow very fast in one direction for 6 months, and then they reverse back again. Now, if you're an ancient sailor and you can learn to surf those winds, you can move from the west coast of India, from Goa or Kerala or Sindh or Gujarat, and find yourself in Roman Egypt in just 2 months. Likewise, if you're on the East Coast, you're in Nagapattinam or Mahabalipuram, Pondicherry, or Tamralipti, that was the ancient Calcutta, you can find your way to the Malacca Straits and beyond to Cambodia and the Mekong Delta in just 2 months. And then you can come back. No other nation has that. So India the two things we've got to realize is that it's India, not China, and it's the sea routes, not the overland routes.
So let's spend some time talking about the trade and cultural ties between ancient India and Rome and explain that. That's where we'll start from as we build and go across the entire region, and the significance of Indian exports to Rome. And I also wonder why Rome was so fascinated with pepper.
Pepper was a big deal. Yes, we take it for granted now, but I'm just trying to wind forward, and here we are. So this is a map based on the kind of Lonely Planet, or the rough guide of the 1st century AD. It's called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. And as you can see from this map, written by a Roman sailor, Roman sailors were not just occasionally setting foot on the west coast of India, they intimately knew every single port. And this book tells sailors where they can sell specific items. So, for example, where's the market for cotton, where they can buy silk. The fact that the king of Gujarat has a taste for Roman singing boys and will pay top dollar if you bring them in your boat. These details are known to every sailor on this route. And as you can see, the little red lines going across, it's very short distance to Aden, then up the Red Sea, and you're in the Roman Empire. If you remember Anti-Cleopatra, go back to your literature classes, Cleopatra and Antony commit suicide, Octavius absorbs Egypt into the Roman Empire. So from that point, the Battle of Actium, suddenly India and Egypt have, if you like, a portal to each other. Rome and India are in direct connection. And this has a dramatic effect. And what are they selling, you asked? Well, here's the answer. We have an extraordinary new document that was discovered by archaeologists 20 years ago called the Muziris Papyrus. And it's a shipping invoice from the 1st century. It's, the sort of thing that's made out in a Bombay shipping company every day of the year today. And it gives a detailed breakdown of one container. What's in that container? So we have a Roman mosaic in Sicily that illustrates this. There's this Yakshi at the center. She's a representation of India for a Roman audience. And look, she's holding in her arm, in the crook of her arm, an outsized elephant tusk. So ivory. Behind her are strings of pepper. So pepper. Wild animals for the circuses, elephants and tigers. And over her limbs, there is silk. And the Periplus says if you want to buy silk, it doesn't know about China. It says you go to Gujarat. So if China and Rome ever did meet, it was in the ports of Roman India.
This is all music to our ears and it's recorded as fact and history, not as mythology, which makes it even more fascinating. We can't give you the whole book. You'll have to read the book for that. But we can breeze through it. And from Rome, I now want to switch to China. And what is fascinating about William's book is the way he's explained how ancient India, not for a few years, but for decades, influenced Chinese empresses who were listening to Indian astronomers, Indian monks, and Buddhism exported out of India was the principal religion of China at that time. So explain that to us, sir.
So I should actually maybe go back and show this extraordinary map of the influence of Buddhism. Because there are so few Buddhists in India today, we don't get to see this map as prominently as perhaps we should. So here at the center of the Gangetic Plain, you have the origins of Buddhism in places like Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, in Sarnath, where the Buddha preached his first sermon. In a matter of 200 or 300 years, it goes up to Pakistan, Gandhara, Afghanistan, Bactria, which is now Central Asia, Uzbekistan. It goes through China to Mongolia, through China to Korea and Japan, and then down from China into Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and the Philippines. This is the golden age of Indian soft power. And remember, it's not just religion which is moving, it's not just the philosophical ideas of Buddhism. It's Indian languages like Sanskrit and Prakrit. And with those languages comes Indian texts about mathematics, about physics, about astronomy, about learning. So this is the moment when India has the most influence in world history. And it is not a passing phase of influence. It's something which completely transforms the rest of Asia until today. The reason when you go to Cambodia today, or go to Thailand today, or go to Sri Lanka today, that the Buddhism is the national religion, is because of what happened at this period. But the thing that I think Indians are not fully aware of is the influence of Buddhism and Indian thought on China. Today, often China and India are made up to be rival poles of influence. But there was never any Chinese religion which came and took over India. But Buddhism is an Indian religion which briefly became the state religion of China. And you see the run-up to this over several hundred years. On the left here, you've got a Mathura Bodhisattva. Mathura, just to the south of here on the way to Agra, wonderful museum. This extraordinary Bodhisattva with the folds of his cloth coming over his tummy, the little belly button. And here on the right, you have a crude Chinese copy of it from several centuries later. But the big thing that most influenced China was the monastery university of Nalanda, which was the Harvard, the Oxbridge, the NASA of its day. And the guy on the right, Xuanzang, in the oldest textbooks he's called Huansang, he comes on foot from China with this backpack full of scrolls because he knows that in the monastery of Nalanda, in Bihar, is the greatest center of learning in the world. And one of the things that you see when you look at Nalanda is the very first plan of a university quad. When you go to Oxford or Cambridge today, think of those lovely grassy squares with Gothic buildings on either side, there's a walkway, and then scholars' rooms. This is the same plan. You've got the square quad in the middle, you've got the walkway, and then scholars' rooms over two angles. And that passes through the Islamic world with the madrasa, which also had that plan, and arrives in Europe in the 12th century. First in Bologna, Spain, and Salerno, then in Oxford and Cambridge. So this idea of a university built in quadrangles or courts, with the scholars' rooms around the edge, this is an Indian idea. And this is the main thing that Xuanzang is coming to India for. This is the great 9-story library of Nalanda. He says that you can study there Vedas, logic, grammar, philosophy, medicine, metaphysics, divination, mathematics, Sanskrit, astronomy, literature, and magic. He says that there are 3 divisions of the library: the Ratnasagra, the ocean of jewels, the Ratnadadi, the sea of jewels, and the Ratnaranjaka, the jewel adorned. And Xuanzang gives this impression of this incredibly scholarly place. He says, the students studied diligently without wasting a moment. There are 100 different lecture halls. The atmosphere of the monastery university was solemn and dignified. And he takes these ideals back with him. But it isn't just to China. On the left, we've got this copper plate, which is the king of Indonesia, Srivijaya, founds an expatriate college for monks from Southeast Asia in Nalanda. And it isn't just Southeast Asia or China, it's also Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Sumatra, Korea.
So Huansang takes these ideas back to the Chinese court. And in the book, the character I found most fascinating, and I want William to tell us a bit about her, is this Chinese empress, Wu Zetian, who almost sounds like an Indian agent of sorts. You've got at the imperial crown in China, a woman who in every way, from astronomy to religion to spirituality, is deeply influenced by India, which I don't know whether people sitting here know, but is actually very fascinating.
Yeah, so this is her. This is Wu Zetian. She's this young woman. She enters the harem of the great Taizong, the great Tang emperor. Here is Taizong on the left. At some point, as the old man is dying, she manages to form a relationship with his son on the right, Gaizong. She looks a bit of an old boot in this picture, but you can see, if you look at the Chinese soap opera around it, so you can see what's going on. She was a mega hottie. And this woman uses her allure to make Buddhism the state religion. She becomes the only reigning emperor who is a woman in 3,000 years of Chinese history. How does she do it? She founds what we today would call a think tank, the Scholars of the Northern Gate. And when Gaizong, her husband, dies, she seizes power with the help of this think tank. And she imposes an Indian religion, Buddhism, on China. It becomes the premier religion of the court. And she uses Nalanda-trained monks, some of them ethnic Indians with names like Gautama Siddhartha, others ethnic Chinese who have studied in India. And for one reign, it's only a brief period, it's one reign, but for 50 years, she introduces Indian ideas into the heart of Chinese court and society. And that's the high watermark, if you like. But it is the moment when India has, in all of history, when India has most influence on China.
You know, after she dies, the Taoists want to come back, and it leads to several complications for the Buddhist monks. But for that, you need to read the book. I'm just kind of pitching your book every once in a way. But one of the most fascinating things, and I think everybody has a general idea about it, is that the biggest Hindu temples are actually not in India. They're in Cambodia, Laos, Bali, Java, that whole Southeast Asia, so deeply connected with India, not through the barrel of the gun, not through the power of the military or the
Correct.
navy, but through the power of Indian intellectual ideas. So tell us about that, India's export to Southeast Asia of intellectual ideas.
So this is happening exactly the same time that Wu Zetian is converting China to Buddhism. Exactly the same time, you have images like this, wonderful statues of Lord Vishnu being carved in Cambodia. And what has happened is that with the fall of the Roman Empire, the old trade routes which faced westwards towards Rome realign themselves. And the Tamil Trade Guild, who are a bit like the East India Company, there's a guild called the 500, who are a bit like the Iron Bank in Game of Thrones. They've got their own corps of assassins. They're quite badass, these guys. They're serious guys. And they swing and pivot eastwards. And what are they doing? They're looking for new sources of gold. The Roman gold is no longer turning up. For 500 years, India has just been receiving tons of gold from Rome in exchange for the ivory and the pepper and the silks and the cotton. Now Rome has fallen, and there's a major economic crisis in India, and the answer is to pivot to look to Suvarnabhumi, still the name of the airport in Bangkok. But in that period, in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, it's the name for the lands of gold. And Suvarnadvipa, the island of gold, is Borneo. So all these places on the map, Palembang, Keling, Kutai, Okeo, these are major sources of gold from India from the 5th century. And so you suddenly find boats like this, these sewn early boats, heading on the monsoon winds no longer westwards, now facing eastwards to Southeast Asia. And from the 5th and 6th century, you see, this are pictures I took recently in Malaysia, in the Bujang Valley. So you see Buddhist monks in bronze, you see lingams and yonis in stone and in bronze, and images of Lord Shiva. And most dramatically, you see, if you go to the Mekong Delta, Indic cities with expatriate Indians giving the model of Indian town planning and architectural ideas, but also religious ideas. And on the edge of the Mekong Delta, you find the very first Hindu temple in Southeast Asia, very small initially, Ashram Maharose at Angkor Borei. Inside that temple, you get these extraordinary images of Lord Rama and Lord Vishnu from the 5th and 6th century, looking very Cambodian. You wouldn't mistake them for an Indian sculpture, but these are obviously Hindu gods who originate in India. But from the beginning, Southeast Asia slightly transforms what's happening. Top right, you've got Jayavarman II, the founder of Angkor Wat. He depicts himself as Lord Vishnu. If you see on the top right, he's holding a discus and a conch. Now, you never have that in India. You never have a king showing himself as Lord Vishnu or Lord Shiva. You have, for example, Raja Chola showing himself with Lord Shiva, but not as Lord Shiva. So as these ideas develop, they are transformed in passage. And so the courts begin to fill with Brahmins. You have local kings changing their names from, like this guy, Kodunga, becomes Mahendravarman. They Sanskritize their names. The whole landscape begins to have Sanskrit names, and the Indian script from Kanchipuram, Pallava Grantha script, is introduced. And to this day, every single script in Southeast Asia is the development of that script, which is why, if you are a Tamil or a Malayalam speaker, you can actually read the beginnings of Thai and Mon and Khmer, and these early scripts are very similar to the Tamil and Kerala scripts. And the landscapes are transformed. The river Mekong gets its name. Mekong is just the Khmer pronunciation of Ma Ganga, Mekong. The rivers have yonis and lingams carved in them to sacralize them. A new Ajanta appears in Thailand, a new Kurukshetra appears in Laos, and soon you're getting these extraordinary temples. On the left, you've got the Shore Temple in Mahabalipuram. On the right, less familiar, Gedong Songo in Java. Very similar plan, but slightly different. And by the 9th century, as you said, the temples are becoming larger. The largest Buddhist temple in the world is Borobudur, this extraordinary step pyramid built in a mandala shape, using Indian ideas, probably planned by a Pallava prince from Kanchipuram, called he's this extraordinary kind of Merlin character from the Pallava court. But finally, Angkor Wat. And Angkor is not only the largest Hindu temple in the world, you can probably argue that the Khmer Empire actually is the largest Hindu empire ever. It has not only the whole of Cambodia and Thailand, but Laos, Burma, a bit of Burma, Thailand. It's the whole area which is absorbed into this. Angkor is the center. It's got 1.2 million inhabitants at a time when London has only 20,000. So this whole world, but what is fascinating is that if you go to it, while it's very clearly based on Indian ideas, it's somehow different. So when Tagore goes there, he says, everywhere I could see India, yet I could not recognize her.
This is an important point, because the fact is that one of the reasons why the ties between India and Southeast Asia, which are so deep, are not celebrated and cherished the way that they should, is because in the past, Indian historians have been guilty of trying to portray the people of these Southeast Asian nations as barbarians, as savages, who were civilized by the presence of Indian navies and merchants. And the fact is that's not true, because they haven't won those areas militarily. They've absorbed the ideas. It's the power of the Indian intellect that actually changed Southeast Asia, not the might of the Indian army.
Correct. And this is very important, because the world is full of empires of the sword, but empires of the spirit, where intellectual ideas conquer other nations by their sheer power and sophistication. That is much more rare in history. And that is what India achieved in Southeast Asia in the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. And what you find is that this whole region now uses Sanskrit as its courtly language. Stories dreamt up here in the area of the Doab and the Gangetic Plain, stories like the Mahabharata, the War of Lanka, the Ramayana, these are sculpted in the Mekong Delta, 10,000 miles east of here, in a completely different part of the world, in a local idiom, but very much telling these Indian stories. So the Indian ability to alter people's mind with storytelling, with mythology, with religion, with philosophy. This is soft power at its most striking.
So we've had soft power going back millennia. Now, many of you would know that the numeral 0 comes from India. But the fact is that the Romans used to use Latin numbers, and even from 1 to 9, the numbers actually come from India, not directly from India to Rome, but via Arabia and the Arab world. So do you want to talk to us about how the numbers that all of us use today, and arguably the only universal language in the world,
correct,
is actually an Indian export?
So when India tries to project its soft power around the world. Often, the idea of yoga is referenced as something which has influenced everywhere. But you can make a much stronger case for Indian numbers, for zero, for the decimal system. All ideas dreamt up in India being this foundational beginning, and as you say, the nearest thing the human race has to universal language. Amazingly, very few people know this outside India, because at some point in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Indian number system, which was always known, when the ideas are traveling, it's always called the Hindu system of number or the modus Indorum in Europe, suddenly becomes Arabic numbers. And it's true that Europe gets them from the Arabs, but the Arabs get them from India. And what we have in front of us now is the oldest zero that is dated in the world, and it's in Gwalior. You can see in the middle row 270. Those are numbers that we can read today.
That's the oldest zero there?
That's the oldest zero. It's in Gwalior, just 2 hours on a train from Delhi. Now here is a map that should be in every school textbook in the world. But again, people don't know this. Brahmi is the original number system used in Ashoka's inscriptions and the Ashoka pillars. That Gwalior inscription comes next. And again, you can see the 2s, the 3s, the 4s, and the 7s are very familiar. And then it goes in 3 different directions. You have the Indian number system continuing in Devanagari in this country. In the heartlands of Arabia, you have the East Arabic numbers. And then, crucially, in Morocco and Islamic Spain, you get what are called the West Arabic numbers developing out of this Gwalior system. By the 15th century, it's looking a bit more recognizable. By the 16th century, it sets. And the numbers on every mobile phone, on every laptop, everywhere around the world become set but they come from India originally. And one of the extraordinary things when I've been touring this book around Europe and so on, is that people all around America, in Britain, in Africa, in Australia, in Canada, they all know the stories of the Greek mathematicians. So everyone can tell you about Archimedes in his bath shouting Eureka. Kids of 7 know this story. Everyone knows about Pythagoras. Everyone knows about pi. But no one outside India knows about Aryabhatta or Brahmagupta, who were mathematicians of absolutely equal stature with Pythagoras and Archimedes, arguably more so, because they basically shepherd this number system that the whole world uses. In just 9 figures plus 0, you can express any number. And the ease with which you can do multiplication with these numbers, with just the 9 symbols, is so much easier. I mean, try doing long multiplication or division with MCV XV1, the Roman system. So how does it get to the Middle East?
This is one second. Can you go back to that? I think that is seriously mind-bending stuff. And I wish I had you as my history professor. That would have been just phenomenal, because the manner in which you're able to bring these stories together just help them register much more. You're not telling us anything new, but it's the manner of the storytelling and bringing
this
it
is not
together.
Controversial stuff. I mean, I don't think anyone challenges this. This is simple fact accepted by scholars everywhere. But it's not widely known. And it's extraordinary that we're here in the 21st century and everyone in America and Europe thinks they're using Arabic numbers. And that is actually quite a recent name, because I say it's recent. In the Middle Ages, people, when these numbers were being introduced, always referred to them as the modus Indorum, the Indian method. So how do they get to the Middle East? This is a quick gallop through the passage. So this character, who many of you will know from Aladdin, the Disney Aladdin, he's actually a historic character, Jafar. He's the vizier of Baghdad. And the viziers of Baghdad are Sanskrit literate Buddhist abbots from Afghanistan, a family called the Pramukhs. When they convert to Islam and move to Abbasids, Pramukh, the Sanskrit word Pramukh, becomes Barmak. And they call from, let's get the map up. They call from Sind, on the right of the map, an embassy that arrives in Baghdad in 776. And they have with them, at the request of the Barmakids, the works of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. Aryabhatta, who comes up with the circumference of the earth and the distance of the earth from the sun in the 5th century during the Gupta period. Brahmagupta, his follower, who comes up with definitions of 0 the first man to define 0 as an active number. These two crucial texts get taken to Baghdad, and there they are translated by a guy called Al-Khwarizmi. Al-Khwarizmi writes a book with this incredibly long title, The Compendious Book of Calculating by Completion and Balancing According to Hindu Calculation. Now, no one wants to use that, particularly in Arabic, that it sounds even longer. So it's known by a nickname, and it's known as Al-Jabr, which is the basis of our word algebra. Well, Al-Khwarizmi, who does the translation and who adds a bit of Euclid and adds a bit of his own ideas, it's not just a translation, that's to do it in justice, but he unravels this complicated Sanskrit mathematics in incredibly simple Arabic prose. Al-Khwarizmi gives his name to algorithm. So algebra and algorithm, two numbers. I mean, algorithm is obviously the word of the moment. Whenever we talk about Elon Musk or Twitter or Facebook or whatever it is, we talk about algorithms. It's at the heart of modern mathematics and computing. It comes from India. This is not controversial. This is a simple matter of fact. How does it get from the Arab world to Europe? That's the next stage. So you've got from Sind to Baghdad, so from the right-hand corner of the map to the middle of the map. Al-Khwarizmi's translation, which is very simple, very clear prose in Arabic, travels through North Africa, from Egypt to Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and into Islamic Spain. And by the 10th century, Christian monks in Spain are beginning to use this system. But astonishingly, it remains the Latin numbers that are used in Northern Europe and Italy and France and Britain up until the 12th century. Now, at that point, if you look at the top of Italy, you can see Pisa. Pisa sends a trade mission to Algeria, and the guy who leads that mission brings his son with him. The son goes to the local school, he learns Arabic, he learns the Arabic number system, and when he goes back home...
Fibonacci.
It's Fibonacci. Luckily for us, it's Fibonacci. And Fibonacci brings the number system that he's learnt in Algeria to Italy. It comes to the attention of the Holy Roman Emperor that he's written this book called the Liber Abaci, explaining the modus Indorum, the Indian method. And he is called to the court in Castel del Monte, where the court astrologer, who I'm glad to say is a Scotsman called Michael Scott, gets him to make it more user-friendly. He says you've got to include, less theoretical, you've got to use weights and measures, usury, double accounting, all the basic methods of this Indian mathematical developments. And the second edition of Liber Abaci goes absolutely crazy. It's the reason that the Medici found the Medici Bank, and later it becomes into the hands of Piero della Francesca. My friend Nick Booker is in the audience here somewhere, who gave me a lot of here he is in the front. He has a particularly fond of a character called Luca Pacioli, who Piero della Francesco gives his mathematical text based on Fibonacci. Pacioli takes it to Milan, where he shares it with his flatmate. His flatmate is Leonardo da Vinci. So it's like a relay race. Leonardo da Vinci to Piero della Francesca. Piero della Francesca to Fibonacci. Fibonacci to Al-Khwarizmi in Baghdad. Al-Khwarizmi to Brahmagupta, sitting in Mount Abu in Rajasthan. From Brahmagupta to Aryabhatta, sitting in Pataliputra in the 5th century. So this relay race of Indian ideas. And again, this is something that everyone should know. It's such basic and important stuff. But I don't understand, in a sense, how we've got to this point where people outside India don't know this at all.
So let's come to, because we're running out of time, I want to come to the politics of history. Chinese President Xi Jinping has run a massive multi-billion-dollar campaign to export the idea of the Silk Route. What is your suggestion to Indian Prime Minister Modi and the Indian government and the Indian people about how to, with facts and conviction, win the global historical argument?
Well, it's not for me to tell a government what to do, but it is a simple fact that India has a claim which is much greater and earlier and precedes the Silk Road, that the Golden Road is something which, I mean, it follows the route westwards of the Middle East economic corridor, which is an idea which is being developed. This is something which India can be proud of, which is absolutely sound historically. One of the frustrations I find is that often, I don't know whether you get this, you have well-meaning patriotic nationalists who have these WhatsApp forwards, and they say India in the Mahabharata period or the Vedic period had helicopters, nuclear weapons, plastic surgery, all the rest of it. And, you know, I want to scream at this point because there are so many things that India can be proud of that are historical and factual and 100% verified, that to start banging on about nuclear weapons in the Mahabharata is just frustrating because it's not true. It's unprovable. And so what I've tried to do in this book is 1/3 of the book is footnotes. Every single source for this, every reading that you could want to do is listed in this book. And I hope it's just a stepping stone for other scholars to take this forward and for Indians to know better what their ancestors achieved.
This has been the most fascinating 45 minutes.
Thank you, Rob.
And thanks to this session, I have had the absolute, I mean, I would have read it in any case, but because of this, I read it more carefully. And I am that much more enriched because of that. For making the effort of bringing the story together, arguably, I think, do you think as well, your greatest work?
Well, it's certainly been the most popular here. It's been number one for 6 months. I have to say, I'm the youngest of 4 brothers, and I always show my books to my elder brothers before I publish them for an honest opinion, which, as you can imagine, as elder brothers, they're only too pleased to do. And they all said, oh, I don't think this one's going to make it. This one is a bit niche. But it absolutely is the most popular book in India I've ever written, and I'm very, very flattered by the reception and very pleased.
And I'm very flattered by having read what you've written. So I just want to thank you for the effort that you made and for coming here and for captivating us with the depth of your research and for the manner in which you're able to tell this story.
Thank you.
You know, so much Game of Thrones, Shakespeare thrown in, which just brings the story alive. Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed this session, can we have a very warm round of applause for William Dalrymple? Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.